the will and the moral clause. There was one sentence in my great-grandmother's will that made the whole family afraid of me. Not because of the money. Not because of the house. Because of a condition that couldn't be bought. The nota. Ree's office smelled of wax and old wood. The air was thick, like dust in the light of a table lamp. On the wall was a portrait of a man with the same chin as the notary sitting across from me. James Harrison, Jr. He sat as still as a metronome, moving his finger down the lines of the document with such care, as if he were holding someone's fate in his hands. Perhaps he was. On the right was my husband, Mark. His hand rested on his knee, his thumb pressing into the fabric, a habit he had when he was nervous. To the left was his mother, Margaret. Perfect hair, a cold smile, a voice that always sounded like "I know best." Behind them stood Richard, Mark's father. He never sat in rooms like this. It was easier to look down from above. Harrison looked up at us and said calmly, "So, Mrs. Elizabeth Monroe leaves her estate and all her assets to her direct great-granddaughter, Mrs. Anna Miller." He paused briefly, subject to the provisions of the main will. The corners of Margaret's lips twitched slightly, as if she had swallowed exactly and held back. Richard nodded slightly, a gesture of victory before the end of the match. "There is one more part," the notary continued, clicking the cap of his pen. "Not legal, but rather moral. Mrs. Monroe asked that her personal instructions be taken into account. She called it a moral clause." Richard snorted briefly. "This isn't a church, Mr. Harrison." "What moral clause?" "There's the law." "There is also free will," the notary replied calmly. "The document states, 'An heiress born of love that does not humiliate or silence.'" The room seemed to lose air for a moment. Mark shuddered and leaned forward. "Excuse me, what does born of love mean?" "It's more of an ethical condition," Harrison explained. "Mrs. Monroe didn't mean an ideal marriage, but a life without being forced to remain silent. She asked that the notary have the right to assess whether love was turning into control." Margaret leaned toward me with a tender smile. "I once signed a similar document. And look how it helped us. Order and clarity, that's what keeps a family together." Her tenderness cut like the edge of a new page. Richard nodded, briefly, imperiously. "Tell me, is this letter legally binding?" "No," sighed the notary. "But it defines my role. If circumstances directly contradict Mrs. Monroe's wishes, I am obliged to record it for the court." Richard raised his voice just enough for the portrait on the wall to hear. "And what do you consider circumstances? Rumors? Family gossip?" "No," Harrison replied calmly. "Actions. Those that can be seen, recorded, proven." I felt Mark squeeze my wrist lightly. He had been doing this since our first date. Back then, it meant "I'm here for you." Now it sounded different, "Say less." Margaret intervened, sweetly but firmly. "Anna, dear, inheritance is a big responsibility. In our family, we don't welcome nervous interpretations of the past. Love is stability. And stability is when you don't take the trash outside." I nodded. Mechanically. Without any meaning. It wasn't agreement, it was a way to stay intact. Harrison turned the last page. "So, I'm keeping Mrs. Monroe's letter under seal. If I see a risk of her will being distorted or pressure being put on the heiress, I have the right to open it." Richard still didn't sit down. "And don't worry," he said, with a barely audible threat in his politeness. "We'll take care of the risks. The law is our family language." His we sounded like a verdict. "The family is the court. And the decision has already been made." After reading, everyone signed the papers. As I was getting up, Harrison quietly touched my shoulder. "Ms. Anna," he said, "Elizabeth often spoke about the right to a voice in the family. If you ever feel that this voice is being taken away from you, please contact me. Come to me first. Not the newspapers, not social media. Just me." "I'm a journalist," I replied. I'm used to calling things by their proper names. That's why I'm warning you, he nodded. Don't let those words become your cage. When we left the office, the sun was so bright that I wanted to close my eyes. Margaret handed me my coat like a leash. Richard gave a brief instruction. We'll stop by the office. Mark, you have a meeting. And you, Anna, take a break. Inheritance is stressful. They spoke as if it were not my life, but a project that needed to be handled correctly. Margaret hugged me on the stairs, demonstratively, perfectly, as if for a photographer. There was no photographer, but the pose remained. Born in love, she repeated softly. How beautiful. We will help you preserve that love. In everything, Anna. I nodded again. And for the second time that day, I felt that this movement changed nothing. Garrison closed the door behind us. I noticed how, once he was alone, he put his hand on the blue envelope, as if checking to see if the heart was still beating. In the car, Richard spoke in a businesslike, even tone. For legal clarity, we will prepare a small package. Standard, confidentiality, communication framework, no repercussions. The estate is not just walls, it's a name. Confidentiality? I looked at Mark. Is this something for the press? Margaret smiled. For peace of mind. It's customary in our circle. 10 years will fly by unnoticed, but everyone will be safe. 10 years? I laughed briefly, without joy. We're talking about love, aren't we? That's exactly why, Richard replied, love cannot tolerate noise. I looked out the window. Charleston moved slowly under the hot sun, the city seemed calm, even indifferent. And I felt the seat belt digging into my shoulder, and for the first time that day, I wanted to get up and run away. In the evening, as I was sorting through documents on the kitchen table, I found a thin card among the papers that I hadn't noticed before. On the back was a short line written in an old but firm hand. When love wants to become law, look for the sound of water. I didn't know yet that in this house, water speaks from the basement. And that its sound opens not only pipes. I thought I lived in a house of love. But it turned out to be a perfectly equipped cage. The Monroe estate stood on a hill, separated from the city by iron gates. When I first saw it after settling the inheritance, it seemed to me that the house was breathing. Inside, it smelled of old books, lemon wax, and something else, invisible, like a memory. Mark said. This place has history. And I thought, no, this place has memory. Margaret was standing in the kitchen, in the light streaming through the stained glass window. She was holding a cup as if it were being photographed for a magazine. Anna, dear, I ordered a new coffee maker for you. You can't even set the right temperature on this old one. Thank you, but I like this one, I replied. It belonged to my great-grandmother. That's exactly why, she smiled. Not everything old needs to be preserved. She said this with the ease with which people tear down walls, convinced that they are doing good. For the first few weeks, Mark and I lived as if in a show house. Everything was shiny, the furniture was perfectly arranged, even the air smelled sterile. And yet there was something dishonest about this shine, like a photo without shadows. Margaret visited almost every day. Sometimes with a pie, Elizabeth's grandson should feel the warmth of home. Sometimes with new curtains, dust collects negative energy. Sometimes with recommendations on order in the family. And every time, with the same impeccable smile, behind which lay must, should, and ought. Mark reacted to this simply, he stopped reacting altogether. His days dissolved into work. In the evening, his laptop, phones, which he checked when he thought I was asleep. When I asked, "Did something happen?" he replied, "No. Just a lot of projects." But once I saw a message he didn't have time to hide. "I can't today. She's here." I didn't know who it was from. And, worse, I didn't dare ask. A month after we moved, Richard brought me a folder. "Just standard documents," he said, placing it on the table in the library. "What is it?" Plans for the coming year. Division of responsibilities. We are a family of lawyers, we always think ahead. I opened the folder. There was a table with the following headings: household, communication, public presence, finances. And in the column opposite each item was a signature, approved by Margaret Miller. What's this column? I asked, pointing to the word behavior. Richard smiled. Just kidding, don't worry. It's just our way of ensuring stability. So if I say something the family doesn't like, that's instability? Anna, his voice became warmer but not softer, you're thinking like a journalist. We're talking about reputation here. About order. That evening, I found an email in my inbox. No signature. Subject, your articles about us. The text was short. They've been published. They're harmful to the family. We're watching to make sure you don't mention the Miller name. I reread it several times. Then I called the editorial office, they said there had been no complaints. So someone was writing from within. Margaret brought lemon cake the next morning. I've seen your articles, she said, cutting the dough with almost festive precision. Very bold topics. But wouldn't it be better to write about something more positive? About people who inspire, rather than expose? I write about the truth, I replied. She looked up. The truth is what keeps a family together, Anna. Everything else is unnecessary noise. Mark came home late that day. I showed him the letter. He read it and just said. Probably some kind of bot. Ignore it. And he left the room. Then I realized that he was already part of this us too. A few days later, a car from the security service arrived at the estate. 2 men installed a new alarm system. For your safety, one of them explained when I asked. But when I tried to change the settings, the code was unknown to me. It turned out that only Richard and Mark knew the passwords. I couldn't sleep that night. The light from the lamp reflected in the mirror opposite the bed, and I kept thinking I saw someone moving there. I moved closer, a small green dot was glowing in the mirror. A camera. I turned off the light. And for the first time, I felt that the house was breathing harder than I was. The next morning, I went to the library to look for Elizabeth Monroe's old records. She had left behind many diaries. The years and dates were written on the spines. The last one was from 1972. There was only one sentence written on the first page. When love demands silence, it is no longer love. I reread it several times, as if to make sure I hadn't imagined it. And then I heard a sound, a quiet, rhythmic dripping. Somewhere under the floor. Margaret knocked on the door. Are you all right, dear? Her voice was sweet, but there was something steely in it. Yes. Just reading. Isn't it too late to be reading old things? They only stir the imagination. And the memory, I replied. She paused. Memory is what we choose to keep. The rest is just noise. The door closed. I stood in the middle of the library, listening to the water dripping behind the wall. Steady. Inevitable. Like a metronome counting down the time until you finally admit to yourself. This is not a home. It's an observation post disguised as a family nest. At night, the house woke up first. And I realized that the sound coming from below was not just water. For the 3rd night in a row, I couldn't sleep. The clock on the nightstand showed 2:37 when I heard it again, a quiet, rhythmic drip 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 somewhere under the floor. Not fast, not random. As if someone was counting down the time. At first, I thought it was the pipes. Old house, old problems. But every night, the sound repeated at the same time. And every night, it changed slightly, sometimes closer, sometimes deeper. As if it were moving beneath me. I left the room barefoot. The hallway was dimly lit, only green dots of cameras flickering in the corners like insect eyes. I knew I could be seen, but I kept going anyway. When I went down to the 1st floor, the dripping became louder. The sound was coming from the library. The wooden floor creaked when I lifted the carpet, and there, under the ornament, was a thin metal handle. I pulled it. Hidden under the carpet was a hatch cover, disguised as parquet. I opened it, and cold air hit my face. It smelled of rust and damp stone. And the same wax that the notary's office smelled of. The next morning, I asked Mark. "Did you know there was a basement under the library?" He didn't take his eyes off his phone. "Yes. Old technical communications." "Why is it locked?" "Because of the humidity. The basement is dangerous. There could be mold." His voice sounded even, practiced. I felt myself, the journalist, awakening after a long sleep. He was lying. When Mark left for work, I went downstairs again. The light from my phone illuminated the stone steps. They led downwards, where the air became thicker. Halfway down, I stopped. Someone had drawn a small wave on the wall with chalk. And under it was the word, "Remember." When I reached the bottom, I saw that the basement wasn't just storing old things. It was furnished, clean, dry, with the light turned off, but with new wires running along the ceiling. On the table was a box wrapped in plastic wrap. Inside were a few yellowed sheets of paper and a small audio recorder. When I pressed the button, there was a rustling sound. And then, a woman's voice. Quiet, old, but clear. "If you can hear this, it means they are still controlling the voices. Do not trust those who call duty love. Their power lies in your silence. Look for the sound of water." I stood in the dark, clutching the player, and thought, she was talking to me. Not to the heiress. Not to the great-granddaughter. To me. When I went upstairs, Margaret was already waiting in the living room. In her hands was a tray of rolls. "Good morning, dear. Do you have keys to all the doors in the house?" Of course, her smile didn't waver. "We're family." "Even the basement?" She paused for just a second. "The basement is dangerous. There could be a leak. I've already been there." The silence between us thickened like syrup. Margaret placed the tray on the table. "An inheritance is not just a gift, Anna. It's a test. Don't look for what you're not ready to find." She left, leaving behind the scent of vanilla and cold fear. That same night, I found a new folder on the table in the library. My name was on the cover. Inside were copies of my letters to the editor, photos from my smartphone, screenshots of correspondence, even drafts of articles. On the last page was a short note. "Breach of confidentiality. Responsibility for the consequences lies with the heiress." I sat there looking at it, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't know whether to cry or laugh. They were setting traps for me, but they were doing it too carefully for people who were just looking out for me. The next morning, I went to Harrison's notary office. His secretary, a woman with kind eyes, recognized me immediately. "Ms. Miller, Mr. Harrison isn't seeing anyone today." "It's important." "I know," she said quietly, leaning closer. She also said, "Look for the sound of water." I froze. "Who is she?" "Mrs. Monroe. I was working here when she came in last time. That's when she left that envelope for you." "Did you know what was in it?" "No," she smiled sadly. "But she said that the truth in your house is always hidden deeper than it seems." That night, I went down to the basement again. But this time, the sound of water was different. It wasn't dripping, but a quiet humming, as if someone had turned on a pump. I found a small metal grate in the floor. Underneath it, a dark liquid glistened, not clean water. Pieces of soggy paper floated on its surface. I picked one of them up. It was a fragment of an old letter. The half-erased words were only partially legible. "If they force me to remain silent, I will leave the truth where it has always flowed." I looked up and saw the red light of a camera flashing right in my face. It was mounted on the basement wall. I took a step back. And for the first time ever, I realized. This wasn't just surveillance. This was an archive. And maybe I was already in it. The house had a place where even sound couldn't enter. They called it the Room of Silence. I found out about it by accident, and now I regret not staying deaf. After that night in the basement, I stopped sleeping properly. My sleep became short and fragmented, like fragments of a recording that someone was constantly rewinding. Mark noticed my fatigue, but said nothing. Margaret, on the other hand, came more often than before. She seemed to sense that I was close to something I wasn't supposed to know about. Once she brought a box of my great-grandmother's things. "This is from the attic," she said. "Maybe something interesting for your journalistic instincts." Her voice sounded slightly ironic, but I noticed that her fingers were clenching the lid of the box too tightly. When she left, I spread the contents out on the table. Photos, faded letters, a silver hairpin, and a leather-bound notebook. On the first page was a familiar handwriting, E.M. 1959. "If this house teaches someone to be silent, it loses its purpose. But silence is convenient for those who have something to hide." I read and felt a chill run down my spine. Next were fragments about Richard Sr., Mark's great-grandfather, and the agreement between the families. The names were smudged with ink, but there was enough left between the lines to understand. The Millers and Monroes had long been connected by something more than marriage. A contract. Not a legal one, a moral one. The same one Harrison had talked about. That evening, I heard the alarm go off in the hallway, a short click, like a door opening. I went out, no one was there. Silence, thick as water in a basement. And then I noticed a small rectangular panel in the wall opposite the library, barely visible among the patterns. It opened when you pressed a certain pattern in the carving. Behind it was a narrow passageway. I turned on my flashlight. Dust in the air glistened like silver ash. Inside was a large metal safe with a screen built into it. The screen flashed green and displayed one word, "Entry permitted." When I touched the screen, a familiar humming sound came from below, the same one I heard from the basement at night. Then a video appeared on the monitor. It was black and white, grainy, old. It showed a young woman with dark hair in a strict dress. She sat in front of the camera, calm, but her eyes were the same as mine. "My name is Elizabeth Monroe. If anyone is watching this, it means that the house still belongs to those who fear the truth. They will call it love, but love without choice is a prison. If you are forced to be silent, look for the Room of Silence. There is the key." The video ended with a sharp click. A narrow line of light lit up on the wall next to it. I pressed my hand against it, and the panel slid to the side. Behind it was another room. A room of silence. Small, without windows. Bare concrete, a wooden table with an old tape recorder and several cassettes on it. One of them was labeled, "Family Council. 1973. I inserted the cassette. A humming sound, then the voice of Richard Sr., low and commanding. "We have no right to allow history to repeat itself. If any of the heirs start digging, stop them. This love is our law. And the law is silent." Then a woman's voice can be heard. Calm, but broken. "You are taking away her right to the truth." And then, a scream, short, sharp. A rustle. Silence. I sat on the floor and held my head in my hands. This was not just a family drama. It was a crime disguised as inheritance. The next morning, I went to Harrison's again. His secretary, the same kind woman, met me looking pale. "Mr. Harrison died last night," she said. "Heart attack." I felt something cold and alive at the same time squeeze my chest. "Are you sure?" I whispered. "Yes. But he left you a package." She handed me an envelope labeled "Do not open at home." Inside was a copy of Elizabeth's will and a short note. "What you are looking for is not in the papers. It is in the voices." That evening, I sat in a quiet room with a tape recorder on my lap. I pressed play one after another, listening to decades speaking in the dark. Confessions, orders, fragments of conversations. They recorded everything, even what couldn't be proven. I realized that this house was an archive of other people's confessions. And that everyone who tried to tell the truth ended up in silence. When I came out, Mark was standing in the doorway. "Did you know about this place?" I asked. His eyes flashed with something like guilt. "Don't do this, Anna. You don't understand how far this goes." "Then explain." He was silent. "Mark," I took a step forward, "if you're hiding something, tell me now." "I can't." He left, and the door closed softly, without a sound. Silence fell over the house again. But now I knew, it wasn't protective. It swallowed everything that lived. It all started with the sound of water. But this time, it didn't bring silence, it brought the voice of a dead woman. After talking to Mark, I couldn't stay in the house. The thought that beneath us was a room where people's confessions had been collected for decades made it impossible to breathe. I walked from room to room, and even the silence seemed artificial to me, like a sound deliberately inserted into a recording to cover up a gap. Closer to midnight, I heard it again. The dripping. The same, steady, inevitable sound. Only this time it wasn't scary, it was calling me. I grabbed a flashlight and went down to the basement. The stairs seemed longer than before. The stone walls glistened with moisture, and I felt a fear growing in my chest, like a memory. Downstairs, water was indeed flowing, a thin stream that broke through from under the floor and disappeared under the grate. Something was glistening on the surface. I crouched down. It was an envelope wrapped in plastic and secured with metal wire. On it was a faded inscription, "To my granddaughter's child." My hands were shaking. I tore open the wrapping and took out several pages, darkened by time. If you are reading this, it means the house is still standing. You have probably already heard their voices, they always sound the same, soft, when they want to silence you. I signed the agreement because I thought silence was the price of peace. But in this house, peace costs a life. They won't kill me, they'll just forget me. So I'm leaving my memory in the water. It remembers everything. On the last page were a few lines written in haste. When they say that love is a duty, know this. Love does not sign its name. I stood amid the dampness and dust, and it seemed to me that the words on the paper were still warm. Suddenly, footsteps sounded from above. Heavy, slow, echoing. I turned off the flashlight. Someone was coming down the stairs. When the silhouette appeared in the doorway, I barely held my breath. It was Richard. In his hand, he held a flashlight and a flare gun. "I told you," his voice sounded hollow. "Some doors are better left closed." "This is a letter from Elizabeth." I lifted the pages. "She knew what you did. She knew a lot. That's why we had to stop her." His tone was as flat as protocol. "You're repeating her mistakes, Anna. And I won't let my son go through this again." "Your son already has," I replied. "Only you didn't notice." Richard took a step forward. I backed up to the grate. The water rushed beneath my feet again. "She left this for me," I said. "And I won't be silent." "You will be silent. Everyone is silent in the end." At that moment, something clicked underfoot, the old mechanism had cracked. The basement shook. The stream of water broke through the metal grate, and a cold wave rushed between us. I felt splashes on my face, grabbed the letters, and rushed to the stairs. When I turned around, Richard was standing knee-deep in water, looking at me with surprise, or fear, or anger, and said, "Water remembers. But people don't." I ran upstairs. The house breathed loudly, as if it too was trying to say something. The living room was lit up. My phone was on the table, recording video. Someone had been watching everything from the cameras in the basement and streamed it right here. On the screen was me, in the dark, with the envelope in my hands, and Richard's voice. Everyone is silent in the end. I pressed save. The file was named evidence_001. MP4. When I caught my breath, a message came to my phone from an unknown number. You are not alone. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Agata Coffee Shop. I stared at the screen for a long time. It could have been anything, a trap, an attempt to help, or someone who also heard the sound of water. But I knew one thing, staying in this house meant disappearing. I gathered the letters, copied them onto a flash drive, and put it in my pocket. Then I walked through the empty corridors one last time. Wet spots still glistened on the walls. They reminded me of handprints, those of people who had tried to escape. When I closed the door, water was still flowing under the floor. And it seemed that the house was finally speaking for itself. When I arrived at the meeting, the woman was already waiting. She knew my name, and what I hadn't yet managed to say out loud. The Agata Coffee Shop was tucked away on the corner of an old street, between a flower shop and an antique store. Rain was tapping lightly on the windows, and the air smelled of wet coffee. I arrived early, in case it was a trap. I sat by the door so I could see the street and ordered tea. My hands were shaking too much for coffee. The woman appeared at exactly 10 o'clock. Gray hair pulled back in a bun, a dark green raincoat, slightly old-fashioned gloves. She approached confidently, like someone who has a right to any table. Anna Miller? She asked. Yes. I'm Agatha Levy. I worked as Richard Miller's secretary. In the 80s. She took off her gloves and placed an old flash drive, the kind that is hardly used anymore, on the table. I knew you were coming when I saw your name in the news. They're already preparing to make you the next story about an unstable heiress. I felt a chill. How do you know about the house? I used to help your great-grandmother. I typed letters for her. One of them was supposed to be an official appeal to the court. But it was never sent? Agatha smiled bitterly. Richard convinced her that silence was the only way to preserve everything she loved. A week after that, she disappeared. She took out an envelope with yellowed papers. This is a copy of the letter she dictated to me on her last day. At the time, I didn't understand why she was in such a hurry. But her voice was just like yours is now. She unfolded the sheets of paper. The handwriting was clear, firm, slightly slanted forward. If love becomes a bargain, it loses its meaning. I signed their papers, but I will not give them my memory. If my great-granddaughter ever finds these lines, let her not seek excuses for those who call control care. They will call it duty. But the real duty is to leave a mark. I felt a lump in my throat. You've kept this all these years? Yes. And I waited for the moment when someone of your blood would dare to speak again. We sat in silence, listening to the rain slowly dripping down the glass. Agatha finally spoke. Richard isn't the first. Their system is based on fear and agreements. They make everyone who joins the family sign a non-disclosure agreement, a so-called moral clause. If anyone breaks it, their reputation is destroyed. She looked at me over her cup. They've already started, haven't they? Yes. Rumors of emotional instability have appeared in the press. My editor has suspended our collaboration. Classic. They operate through doubt. How can this be stopped? Only through publicity. Bring everything out into the open. But then? You'll become a target. I smiled through my exhaustion. I think I already am. Agatha leaned closer, her eyes shining with a determination that had nothing to do with fear. There's one more thing. She handed me a flash drive. These are recordings. The same ones that were made in the silence room. They thought they had erased everything, but I made a copy. How did you gain access? I was the one who deciphered their protocols. At the time, I thought I was just a secretary. Then I realized I was transcribing crimes. I took the flash drive, and she suddenly touched my hand. Don't do this alone, she said quietly. Find allies. And remember, they're not afraid of the truth, they're afraid of the voice. When Agatha left, I stayed for another minute. The rain turned into a downpour, and water ran down the street, forming small streams that merged at the storm drains. It seemed to me that the whole world was whispering one word: remember. I went out into the rain without an umbrella. The flash drive in my pocket felt hot, like a pulse. At that moment, I realized that everything they had been building for decades, fear, control, silence, was beginning to crack. And for the first time ever, I felt not only fear, but also anger. Alive, real, cleansing. That night, I inserted the flash drive into my laptop. The name of the folder appeared on the screen: Miller_family_audio. 27 files. One of them was from 1973. Another was from 2015. The last one was marked with yesterday's date. I pressed play. The voice that came out of the speakers was male, low, calm. And all too familiar. She found the letter. We can't take any chances. Do everything like last time. It was Richard. They always said that the truth was a matter for lawyers. I decided to show that sometimes the truth is a matter for those who survived. It all started with a video that I didn't plan to publish. The flash drive with the recordings had been sitting on my desk for 2 days. Each file was a piece of history, each voice proof that the moral clause was not a metaphor but a system of punishment. They all knew. And they all kept quiet. I didn't know what to do until I received a letter from Harrison Jr., the notary. Mrs. Miller, discrepancies have been found in the inheritance case. If you have evidence of influence or coercion, bring it to court. Only then can we officially open the case. It was an invitation. Or a warning. I sent several audio files anonymously to a journalist in New York, a former colleague. And within a day, the story exploded. The Miller family's moral clause: how Charleston lawyers forced the heirs to remain silent. That was the headline on the front page. The article began with the words: "The evidence was obtained from an unknown source, but its authenticity has been confirmed by experts." An hour after publication, Mark called me. "What have you done?" "What you couldn't do," I replied. "I stopped keeping quiet." "You destroyed us." "I just showed that we were already destroyed." After that, the connection was lost. The next morning, journalists were standing outside my house. Some were holding microphones, others had phones. I opened the door, and the smell of flashbulbs filled the air. "Mrs. Miller, is it true that you have direct evidence against your husband's family? Are they trying to intimidate you? Is this a family matter or a personal vendetta?" I didn't answer. I just walked through the crowd, holding a black folder in my hands. The same one Harrison had given me. Now it contained copies of all the recordings. The courtroom smelled of cold and coffee. Richard sat across from me, calm, as if this were just a routine business meeting. Next to him was Margaret, perfect as always. Mark didn't look at me at all. The judge, a woman in her 60s, glanced at the documents and said, "Today we are considering a request to verify the validity of Elizabeth Monroe's will and the impact of the moral clause on the heiress." "Your Honor," the Miller's lawyer stood up, "this case is a farce. None of the materials provided have any official legal force." "Perhaps," I replied calmly, "but they have a voice. And a voice is also evidence." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Explain." I opened my laptop and turned on the audio. Richard's voice was cold, steady, familiar. "We can't take any chances. Do everything like last time." The courtroom fell silent. It lasted longer than any of the speeches. After the hearing, Mark approached me. "Do you think this will save you?" he asked quietly. "No," I replied. "But it will destroy your prison." "He won't forgive you." "I'm not asking him to." I was already heading for the exit when he added, "You don't even know how many people signed those papers. It's not just our family. It's the whole system." I turned around. "All the better. It's time to break the system." That evening, television channels aired a short report. Journalists stood outside the courthouse, talking about an unprecedented case that could change the concept of family law. A quote from my speech appeared on the screen. "When love becomes the law must be changed." Harrison called me. His voice was calm, but I could sense the tension. "Mrs. Miller, be careful. We have information that a counterclaim is being prepared against you." "Let them. Now everything is public. That's why they're more dangerous than ever." I ended the day in an empty apartment, listening to the water running in the pipes again. This time the sound was not disturbing, more like a stubborn heartbeat. I wrote in my diary. They wanted silence. I gave them an echo. They didn't go to court. They went to Google. 3 days after the hearing, I woke up to a call from my editor. His voice was dry, like an official letter. "Anna, we are temporarily suspending our collaboration until the circumstances are clarified." "What circumstances?" "Some materials have been published of an unpleasant nature." I opened my laptop and typed my name into the search engine. Dozens of articles, videos, and blogs appeared on the screen. Journalist Anna Miller, an heiress with a persecution complex. Sources confirm she falsified evidence to get the estate. Ex-husband says she needs help, not a trial. I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet. Not even out of anger, out of pure, sudden helplessness. Everything I had built was now being used against me. Mark appeared on television. His voice was calm and gentle, his eyes moist, like a man who still loves, but must tell the truth. "Anna is talented but vulnerable. We are all concerned about her condition. It's not about money, it's about care." Care. The same word they once used to describe control. I sat in front of the screen and watched him play the role I once thought was sincerity. The next day, social services came to see me. A neighbor had accidentally reported that I was in an unstable emotional state. They politely asked if I was alone or if someone was helping me. I smiled and answered like a journalist, briefly, to the point. They wrote everything down in a notebook and left. And I remained sitting in silence, which now smelled of gunpowder. That same evening, I received a message from an unknown number. "You will not win the war against the people who invented the law." I did not respond. I just sent the screenshots to my lawyer, Sandra. She called almost immediately. "This is a threat. We'll involve the police." "They're already everywhere," I said. "The police won't change anything if every news story makes me look crazy." "Then we'll use their words as your weapon." We prepared a statement. Short, public, emotionless. "I am a journalist. I have evidence. And I will not disappear." It spread across social media. Support began to pour in from colleagues, former students, even women I didn't know. Some wrote. "I signed a non-disclosure agreement. Now I realize I'm not alone." When I read these comments, I felt a little better for the first time. A voice is contagious. It spreads faster than lies if left unchallenged. But the Millers didn't stop. A week later, an article appeared in the local newspaper with an excerpt from a psychological evaluation that I had never undergone. Mrs. Miller exhibits signs of obsessive behavior, compulsive control, and paranoia. Signed, Dr. L. Kelly, consultant for Miller and Associates. I laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. And I did what they didn't expect. I posted the article on my profile with the caption. "They call it paranoia. I call it memory." Within an hour, the post had been shared 10,000 times. The next day, Sandra brought the news. "The court has accepted the request for a re-examination of the will." Where did the signal come from? Harrison. He found another document in the archives. Stamped 1979. I looked at her and felt something like relief in my chest for the first time in many days. "Are we going to court again?" "Yes," Sandra replied. "But now you're not alone." She opened the folder. Inside were 23 statements. Women who had once signed those same moral clauses. In the evening, I went out onto the porch. The city was noisy, like a river after a storm. I listened to the noise and thought about how they wanted to destroy me with publicity, but instead forced me to become a voice that cannot be silenced. A message from an unknown sender flashed on my phone. This time, it was just one sentence. Tomorrow is the trial. And this time, we'll all be there. I thought the scariest thing was to tell the truth. But it turned out that waiting for it to be heard was even scarier. That morning, the city was strangely quiet. Even the trams seemed more cautious than usual. I stood in front of the courthouse and watched the sun slowly rise in the sky, pale, as if hesitating whether to shine. Sandra was standing next to me. "Are you ready?" she asked. "No," I answered honestly. "But when has that ever stopped anyone?" We walked past the crowd, journalists, cameras, people with #LetHerSpeak signs. Some just stood silently. And this time, I didn't feel afraid. Just a tremor in my hands, the same one you get before a big conversation you've been preparing for your whole life. The room was crowded. On the bench opposite were the Millers, impeccable, like wax figures. Richard, with the same smile that once seemed calm to me. Now it reminded me of a blade. Mark didn't look at me. Perhaps he was afraid to meet my gaze. Or maybe he was afraid to see that I was no longer the person he had left. The judge declared the hearing open. Her voice was steady but warm. Maybe it was just my imagination. But for the first time, I heard something human in the room. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up. My heart was beating in my throat. I didn't have a speech. There were no notes, no outline, nothing. Just the same words I had repeated to myself at night when I thought I couldn't take it anymore. I was taught, I began, that love is when you trust. But here, in this family, love meant silence. You could be hugged, but only to check if you were still obedient. I paused and took a breath. I didn't come here for money, property, or a name. I came to show that the truth can survive even after silence. The judge nodded, and Sandra connected her laptop to the projector. On the screen was one of the last recordings. The one I was afraid to even listen to. Richard's voice. "If she doesn't keep quiet, do what you did last time. You know it worked with Elizabeth." The room was dead silent. Someone dropped a pen. Mark raised his head for the first time during the entire trial and just froze. The judge stopped the recording and said, "Can you confirm that this is Mr. Miller's voice?" I replied briefly, "Yes. And I'm not the only one. There is expert evidence." The Miller's lawyers tried to object, saying something about file manipulation and selective editing. But it was too late. The words had been spoken. They cannot be taken back, like a signature. When the hearing ended, the judge said that the decision would be made tomorrow. But we all knew, the verdict had already been made. Not by the court, but by people. Richard walked down the hallway, holding himself straight, but his eyes were empty. Margaret was crying. Mark just walked past me. And for a second, it seemed to me that he wanted to say something. But he didn't. Maybe for the first time in his life, he couldn't find the right words. In the evening, I sat at home, wrapped in a blanket. The phone wouldn't stop ringing, calls, messages, journalists, friends. But I didn't answer anything. I just stared out the window at the rain. Now the water sounded different. Not like danger, like purification. I took Elizabeth's letter, the one I found in the basement. I read it again. If love becomes a bargain, it loses its meaning. If you are forced to remain silent, leave a trace. I smiled. I left it, I whispered. And this time it won't be erased. The next morning, the judge read out the decision. The clause is declared illegal. The inheritance documents are to be rewritten. The case of Elizabeth Monroe is to be reviewed. The case of forced silence shall be referred to the prosecutor's office. Someone in the courtroom applauded. Not me. I just sat there and felt something big and scary passing through me, like a house that had been holding its breath for a long time finally exhaled. After the hearing, Agatha came up to me. She hugged me as tightly as only those who have been through the same war can hug. She would be proud of you, she said. I think she is in me, I replied. Her voice, her water, her silence. Now they are all mine. That evening, I returned to that house for the first time in a long time. The doors no longer creaked, and the basement was dry. I turned on the light in the quiet room. The tape recorder was still on the table. I pressed play. Instead of the old recordings, there was only the sound of air. And then, one short line, as if someone had left it at the end of the tape. The silence hasn't disappeared. It just learned to speak with your voice. 3 years have passed. But sometimes, when I hear water dripping, it seems to me that the house is still listening. I moved. I didn't run away, I just moved. In the new house, the smell of coffee mixes with the smell of paint and children's books, and instead of portraits of ancestors, there are photos of those I chose myself. Life has sound again. Quiet, ordinary, but real. After the trial, it was noisy. Weeks of interviews, headlines, talk shows. People argued, who am I, a heroine or a madwoman? But I just wanted to sleep without feeling like someone was watching me. So I turned everything off. The phone, the TV, the world. And for the first time in a long time, I just kept quiet, of my own free will. Agatha visits every Saturday. She brings apple pie, which is always a little burned around the edges. We sit in the kitchen, drink tea, and laugh at how she still hasn't learned to use a laptop. Sometimes she says, Elizabeth would never have believed she would live to see this end. Maybe that's why we lived for her, I reply. Mark went abroad. I found out by accident, from the news, the son of businessman Miller is leaving the country for permanent residence. No comments, no explanations. And, perhaps for the first time, I felt not anger, but relief. Finally, everything fell into place. I sold that old house to the state. Now it's an archive. Yes, an official one. They named it the Elizabeth Monroe Foundation. Every day, people come there, lawyers, students, researchers, to listen to recordings from the quiet room. And every time I walk by, I see children running around the former yard, and I think, yes, this is true purification. Sometimes I am invited to speak. At forums, colleges, even judges' associations. I always start the same way. My name is Anna Miller. And I grew up in silence. And then I say, you know, silence is not emptiness. It's just waiting for someone to find the courage to fill it. After the speeches, young girls come up to me. They say, I signed too, because I was afraid. And I always reply, fear is the first sound that truth makes. Don't silence it. When everyone leaves in the evening, I go home, put the kettle on, and open the window. Somewhere nearby, I can hear the river flowing. Its sound is like a breath. It reminds me that everything moves on, even things that once seemed frozen. I wrote this down for myself. Truth does not destroy silence. It makes it alive. And perhaps this is what Harrison meant when he said, what you are looking for is not in the papers. It is in the voices. This morning I found a small, unsigned package on my doorstep. Inside was an old tape recorder. And a cassette tape. On it was just one word, remember. I put it in the player. After a short hiss, something very simple came through, the sound of dripping water. 3 times. Then a woman's voice, barely audible but familiar. The house is free. I turned off the tape recorder and closed my eyes. I smiled. Because I knew it wasn't the end. Just silence speaking again.